Picture this. You're standing in a moonlit grove somewhere in ancient Germania. The year is 98 AD. The air is thick with smoke from burning oak branches, and you can hear the rhythmic beating of drums echoing through the forest. Your heart pounds as you witness something that would make your blood run cold. In the center of a stone circle, a figure draped in wolf pelts raises a golden blade toward the stars. This isn't just any ceremony, this is a royal blood ritual, where kings and queens believed they could speak directly to the gods through acts so violent, so brutal, that Roman historians refused to record the full details. You watch in horror as the blade comes down, and you realize you're witnessing one of the most disturbing aspects of ancient power. The belief that divine authority could only be maintained through human sacrifice. The screams that pierce the night air aren't just from victims, they're from royal participants who willingly shed their own blood, believing that only through pain and death could they preserve their right to rule. This was the reality for countless rulers throughout the pagan world, from the fog-shrouded forests of northern Europe to the sun-baked temples of ancient Mexico. These weren't primitive savages acting on impulse. These were sophisticated civilizations with complex theological systems that demanded blood as the price of political legitimacy. Before diving into these forgotten stories of ritual and sacrifice, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another collection of ancient myths or Hollywood fantasies. These are documented historical practices that shaped the very foundation of royal power for thousands of years. The blood-soaked rituals we'll explore weren't aberrations or occasional extremes. They were systematic, institutionalized practices that defined what it meant to rule in the ancient world. To understand these rituals, we must first understand the fundamental belief system that created them. Ancient pagan societies didn't separate religion from politics the way we do today. For them, earthly power was literally divine power made manifest. Kings weren't just political leaders, they were living bridges between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. This connection wasn't metaphorical, it was visceral, physical, and required constant renewal through blood. The Celtic Druids of Britain and Gaul developed perhaps the most sophisticated theological justification for royal blood sacrifice. They believed that the land itself was a living entity that demanded nourishment from its rulers. Every harvest, every victory in battle, every year of peace and prosperity had to be purchased with royal blood. The king wasn't just responsible for governing his people, he was literally responsible for feeding the spiritual forces that sustained the kingdom. Roman writers like Tacitus and Pliny the Elder documented these practices with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. They described groves where Celtic royalty would gather during times of crisis, offering their own blood and the blood of captives to ensure divine favor. But what the Romans didn't fully grasp was the theological complexity behind these rituals. This wasn't random violence, it was a carefully orchestrated system of spiritual governance that had been refined over centuries. The process typically began at dawn, when the Druids would lead the royal participants to sacred groves that had been used for these ceremonies for generations. These weren't just any forests. They were carefully maintained temple complexes where every tree, every stone, every stream held specific religious significance. The oak trees were considered especially sacred because the Celts believed they were conduits through which divine energy flowed from the sky to the earth. Archaeological evidence from sites across Britain and Ireland reveals the sophisticated nature of these ritual spaces. Excavations have uncovered elaborate stone circles, carefully arranged altar stones stained with what analysis confirms was human blood, and burial pits containing the remains of individuals who died during these ceremonies. The precision of the arrangements suggests that every aspect of these rituals followed strict protocols that had been passed down through generations of druidic training. The royal participants themselves underwent extensive preparation before these ceremonies. For days or even weeks beforehand, they would fast, purify themselves through ritual baths, and undergo intensive spiritual counseling with the druids. This wasn't a casual decision. Committing to participate in a blood ritual meant accepting the possibility of death in service to the kingdom. The actual ceremonies varied depending on the specific need being addressed. Rituals to ensure good harvests differed from those designed to bring victory in war or to end plagues. But all of them shared certain common elements: the shedding of royal blood, the offering of that blood to specific deities, and the belief that this sacrifice would compel divine intervention on behalf of the kingdom. During harvest rituals, the king or queen would make cuts on their arms and hands, allowing their blood to drip onto freshly harvested grain. This grain would then be distributed throughout the kingdom, carrying the royal essence to every corner of the realm. The belief was that consuming grain blessed with royal blood would bind the people spiritually to their ruler while ensuring the land's continued fertility. War rituals were far more dramatic and dangerous. Before major battles, Celtic royalty would gather with their druids to perform ceremonies designed to terrify enemies and guarantee victory. These involved not just the shedding of royal blood, but elaborate displays of ritual combat where kings and queens would fight against captive enemies or even against each other. The blood spilled during these mock battles was believed to feed the war gods and ensure their support in the actual conflict to come. But perhaps the most terrifying rituals were those performed during times of plague or natural disaster. When the kingdom faced existential threats, the druids taught that only the ultimate sacrifice could restore divine favor. This didn't always mean death, but it did mean that royal participants had to be willing to die. Some rulers survived these extreme rituals, emerging with terrible scars that marked them as chosen by the gods. Others didn't survive at all, their deaths interpreted as necessary payments to restore cosmic balance. The psychological impact of these rituals on the rulers who participated in them was profound and lasting. Imagine being raised from childhood with the knowledge that your right to rule depended not just on political skill or military prowess, but on your willingness to shed your own blood in service to supernatural forces. Every Celtic prince and princess grew up knowing that someday they might be called upon to risk their life in a sacred grove, with no guarantee they would emerge alive. This created a unique form of royal psychology that was unlike anything found in other ancient civilizations. Celtic rulers weren't just political leaders or military commanders. They were essentially priest kings and priest queens who had to maintain their legitimacy through constant spiritual risk-taking. The scars they bore from these rituals weren't seen as disfigurements but as marks of divine favor, proof that they had been tested by the gods and found worthy. The druids who orchestrated these ceremonies held enormous power within Celtic society, but their position was also extremely precarious. They were responsible for interpreting the will of the gods and determining when blood rituals were necessary. If their advice led to disaster, if a king died during a ritual that failed to bring the desired results, the druids themselves could face execution. This created a complex dynamic where religious and political power were constantly balanced against each other through ritualized violence. From the misty forests of Celtic Britain, our story moves to the frozen fjords of Scandinavia, where Norse royalty developed their own equally brutal system of blood sacrifice. The Viking concept of royal legitimacy was built around the idea that kings were literally descended from the gods, particularly Odin, the All-Father who ruled over war, wisdom, and death. Norse sagas preserved in medieval Icelandic manuscripts provide detailed accounts of these royal blood rituals, though the Christian scribes who recorded them often tried to sanitize or condemn the practices they described. Reading between the lines of these sources reveals a systematic approach to royal sacrifice that was every bit as sophisticated as the Celtic traditions, though based on different theological principles. The most important Norse blood ritual was the blot, a ceremony that could range from relatively simple offerings to elaborate festivals involving the sacrifice of dozens of animals and multiple human victims. Royal blots were special occasions that demonstrated the king's ability to communicate directly with the gods and secure their favor for the entire kingdom. The preparation for a royal blot began months in advance. The king would consult with his Gaudi, priest advisors who specialized in interpreting divine will, to determine the appropriate scale and nature of the sacrifice required. These weren't arbitrary decisions, but were based on careful observation of omens, dreams, and seasonal cycles that indicated what the gods demanded. The actual ceremony took place at specially constructed temples or outdoor sacred sites that were considered direct connections to Asgard, the realm of the gods. Archaeological excavations at sites like Gamla Uppsala in Sweden have revealed elaborate temple complexes where these royal sacrifices took place. The remains found at these sites tell a story of systematic ritual violence that spanned centuries. During the ceremony, the Norse king would personally participate in the killing of sacrificial victims, believing that only royal hands could ensure the offering reached the gods. But more than that, the king was expected to shed his own blood as well, usually by cutting his palm and allowing the blood to mix with that of the sacrificial victims. This mingling of royal and sacrificial blood was seen as creating a spiritual bond that compelled divine attention. The psychological preparation for these rituals was as important as the physical preparations. Norse kings underwent vision quests and spiritual ordeals designed to prepare them for direct contact with the gods. These often involved self-inflicted wounds, prolonged fasting, and exposure to extreme cold, all designed to push the ruler to the edge of death where divine communication was believed to be possible. What made Norse blood rituals particularly distinctive was their emphasis on the king's willingness to sacrifice himself if necessary. Unlike many other ancient cultures where rulers used surrogates or captives for the most dangerous rituals, Norse tradition demanded that the king be personally willing to die for his people. This wasn't just theoretical. Sagas record instances where kings who failed to bring divine favor through their sacrifices were themselves killed by their own subjects, their deaths interpreted as necessary offerings to restore cosmic balance. The most extreme example of Norse royal sacrifice was the practice of king killing during times of prolonged crisis. When famines, plagues, or military defeats persisted despite repeated blood offerings, the Norse believed that the king himself had lost divine favor and needed to be replaced through ritual death. These weren't assassinations or political coups, but religious ceremonies where the king voluntarily submitted to death in hopes that his sacrifice would restore prosperity to the kingdom. The ritual killing of Norse kings followed specific protocols that were designed to ensure the death served its spiritual purpose. The king would be taken to a sacred grove or temple, often the same site where he had previously performed blood sacrifices for others. He would be given the opportunity to make final offerings and prayers before being killed, in a manner that the gods were believed to favor, usually hanging, which was associated with Odin's own self-sacrifice on the world tree. These voluntary royal deaths created a unique dynamic in Norse politics where kings ruled with the constant knowledge that their lives could be forfeit if they failed to maintain divine favor. This wasn't tyranny in the conventional sense. It was a form of spiritual contract, where the ruler's life was literally held hostage to his ability to serve as an effective intermediary between the human and divine worlds. The psychological impact of this system on Norse royalty was profound. Kings lived with constant awareness that their political failures could result in ritual death, while their subjects viewed royal sacrifice as a normal and necessary part of governance. This created a culture where political and spiritual authority were inseparably intertwined through systematic violence. But the Norse weren't content to limit their blood rituals to their own territories. When they expanded across Europe through raiding and conquest, they brought their sacrificial practices with them, often adapting local traditions to fit their own theological framework. Viking raids weren't just military campaigns. They were religious expeditions designed to capture sacrificial victims for use in royal blood rituals back home. The blood-soaked rituals of pagan royalty weren't isolated practices limited to a few barbaric tribes. They were systematic, institutionalized approaches to governance that shaped the development of political power across multiple continents and cultures. From the Celtic groves of Britain to the Norse temples of Scandinavia, From the steppes of Central Asia to the rainforests of Central America, royal blood sacrifice represented one of humanity's most persistent and disturbing attempts to bridge the gap between earthly and divine authority. The evidence for these practices extends far beyond the documented rituals of Celtic druids and Norse kings. Across the vast steppes of Central Asia, nomadic royal dynasties developed their own sophisticated systems of blood sacrifice that would influence political structures from Mongolia to Eastern Europe. The Scythian kings, who ruled over territories stretching from the Black Sea to the borders of China, created perhaps the most elaborate royal sacrifice protocols in the ancient world. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, provided detailed accounts of Scythian royal funeral rites that involved the systematic killing of hundreds of individuals to accompany the dead king into the afterlife. But what he only hinted at were the living rituals, the blood ceremonies that Scythian rulers performed while still alive to maintain their connection to the sky god Pepeus and the earth goddess Api. These weren't simple offerings, but complex theatrical productions that could last for weeks. The Scythian king would begin by selecting victims from among captured enemies, but the ritual required that he personally draw first blood. Using a sacred golden dagger passed down through generations of rulers, the king would make deep cuts across his chest and arms, allowing his blood to flow into specially crafted bronze cauldrons that had been used for these ceremonies for centuries. The psychological preparation for these rituals was as brutal as the ceremonies themselves. Scythian princes underwent years of training designed to deaden their natural human revulsion to violence and death. They were forced to participate in increasingly violent rituals from childhood, gradually building their tolerance for the extreme acts they would eventually be required to perform as kings. Archaeological discoveries in Scythian burial mounds across Ukraine and southern Russia have revealed the physical evidence of these practices. Excavations at sites like Pazyryk and Chertomlik have uncovered elaborate golden vessels stained with human blood, ceremonial weapons designed specifically for ritual use, and the remains of hundreds of sacrificial victims arranged in precise patterns that reflected complex theological beliefs about death and divine authority. But perhaps most disturbing are the remains of the kings themselves. Many Scythian royal skeletons show evidence of repeated ritual scarification, deliberate cuts and wounds that were made during life and allowed to heal, creating permanent marks of divine favor. Some skeletons reveal wounds so severe that they would have been life-threatening, suggesting that Scythian kings regularly risked death in their blood rituals. The Scythian approach to royal sacrifice influenced nomadic peoples across Central Asia for centuries. The Hunnic kings who terrorized the Roman Empire adopted modified versions of Scythian blood rituals, as did the early rulers of the Turkic Khaganates. Even Genghis Khan and his successors incorporated elements of these ancient sacrificial traditions into their own ceremonies, though by that time the practices had evolved into more symbolic forms. Moving westward, the Germanic tribes that would eventually overthrow the Roman Empire had their own deeply rooted traditions of royal blood sacrifice. The bog bodies discovered across northern Europe, perfectly preserved human remains found in peat bogs, represent only a fraction of the victims of Germanic royal rituals. Recent archaeological analysis has revealed that many of these bog bodies were not random sacrifices, but carefully selected individuals who died as part of elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure royal legitimacy. The Germanic concept of royal blood sacrifice was built around the belief that kings were chosen by the gods but had to prove their worthiness through acts of extreme violence. The ritual known as the blood eagle, where victims were killed by having their ribs cut away from their spine and their lungs pulled out to form wing-like shapes, wasn't just a method of execution but a religious ceremony that Germanic royalty used to demonstrate their divine connection. Germanic queens participated in these rituals as actively as their male counterparts. The archaeological record reveals numerous examples of royal women who bore the scars of ritual participation, and some who died during particularly extreme ceremonies. The famous bog body, known as the Agved girl, appears to have been a Germanic princess who died during a royal blood ritual, her body carefully prepared and placed in the bog as part of the ceremonial aftermath. The psychological impact of these practices on Germanic royal families was devastating and transformative. Children born into these dynasties grew up watching their parents engage in systematic violence as a normal part of governance. They learned to associate political power with the willingness to inflict and endure extreme physical trauma. This created generations of rulers who saw brutality not as a regrettable necessity but as a sacred duty. The conversion of Germanic tribes to Christianity didn't immediately end these practices, but instead drove them underground or transformed them into supposedly Christian ceremonies. Many of the saints venerated by early medieval Germanic Christians were actually royal figures who had died during their traditional blood rituals, their deaths reinterpreted through Christian theology to make them acceptable to the new faith. From the forests of northern Europe, our journey takes us across vast oceans to the civilizations of pre-Columbian America, where royal blood sacrifice reached perhaps its most sophisticated and systematic expression. The Maya, Aztec, and Inca empires all developed elaborate theological systems that made royal blood sacrifice central to governance. But each approached the practice in distinctly different ways. Maya royalty perfected the art of auto-sacrifice, the ritualized shedding of their own blood to communicate with the gods and maintain cosmic balance. Unlike many other cultures where kings used surrogates or captives for the most dangerous rituals, Maya rulers personally underwent extreme forms of bloodletting as regular parts of their royal duties. The Maya believed that royal blood was qualitatively different from that of commoners, that it contained a divine essence that made it particularly pleasing to the gods. This belief led to the development of increasingly elaborate and painful methods of royal bloodletting. Maya kings would pierce their tongues, earlobes, and genitals with obsidian blades, stingray spines, and specially designed bone implements, collecting their blood on bark paper that would then be burned to carry their offerings to the divine realm. The psychological preparation for Maya auto-sacrifice began in early childhood. Royal children were gradually introduced to pain through increasingly intense rituals designed to build their tolerance for the extreme bloodletting they would eventually be required to perform. By adulthood, Maya rulers could endure forms of self-mutilation that would have killed or permanently disabled individuals who hadn't undergone this systematic conditioning. Maya queens participated in these rituals as actively as their husbands, often undergoing even more extreme forms of bloodletting. The famous Lintel 24 from Yaxchilan depicts Queen Lady Zok pulling a rope studded with thorns through her tongue, while her husband performs his own blood sacrifice. This wasn't an exceptional scene, but a representation of normal royal behavior in Maya society. The frequency of these royal blood sacrifices was staggering. Maya rulers were expected to shed their blood during every major ceremony, seasonal transition, and political crisis. Some rulers performed bloodletting rituals multiple times per week throughout their reigns. The cumulative physical damage from decades of systematic self-mutilation often left Maya kings and queens severely scarred, partially disabled, or suffering from chronic infections. The Aztec Empire took royal blood sacrifice in a different direction, developing massive public ceremonies where the emperor's bloodletting was combined with the sacrifice of hundreds or thousands of captives. These weren't just religious events, but political spectacles designed to demonstrate the ruler's power over life and death, while reinforcing the theological foundations of imperial authority. Aztec royal blood rituals typically took place atop the great temple pyramids that dominated their cities. The emperor would begin the ceremony by using obsidian knives to make deep cuts across his body, allowing his blood to flow down the temple steps while priests simultaneously sacrificed lines of captive enemies. The mixing of royal and enemy blood was believed to create a spiritual communion that granted the gods favor to the Aztec state. The scale of these ceremonies was unprecedented in human history. During the dedication of the Great Temple at Tenochtitlan, Aztec sources claim that Emperor Ahuitzotl personally participated in the sacrifice of over 20,000 captives over the course of 4 days. While these numbers may be exaggerated, archaeological evidence confirms that Aztec royal blood rituals involved thousands of deaths and required systematic organization on an industrial scale. The psychological conditioning required to participate in these mass sacrifices created a unique form of royal personality. Aztec emperors weren't just political or military leaders. They were essentially high priests of a death cult who had to maintain their spiritual authority through constant participation in organized killing. This created rulers who viewed mass violence not as a regrettable necessity, but as a sacred duty essential to the survival of the cosmos. The Inca Empire developed perhaps the most systematic approach to royal blood sacrifice, creating an elaborate calendar of ceremonies that required the participation of the royal family throughout the year. Inca rulers believed they were direct descendants of Inti, the sun god, and that their blood contained solar essence that needed to be regularly renewed through ritual sacrifice. Inca royal blood ceremonies were carefully choreographed events that combined auto-sacrifice with the killing of specially selected victims. The emperor would begin by making cuts on his arms and chest, allowing his blood to flow into golden vessels while priests simultaneously sacrificed llamas, children, and adult captives chosen for their physical perfection. The selection of sacrificial victims for Inca royal ceremonies followed strict protocols based on physical appearance, social status, and spiritual purity. Children chosen for sacrifice underwent months of preparation, during which they were fed special diets, dressed in elaborate clothing, and treated as living gods before their ritual deaths. The psychological impact on both the victims and the royal participants was profound and lasting. These blood-soaked rituals weren't aberrations or temporary practices that disappeared with the rise of more civilized societies. They represented fundamental approaches to governance that shaped human political development for thousands of years. The scars they left, both physical and psychological, can still be traced in the political structures and cultural assumptions that define modern societies. The rulers who participated in these rituals weren't monsters or primitive savages, but sophisticated political leaders who genuinely believed that their authority depended on their willingness to engage in systematic violence. They created complex theological systems to justify their practices and developed elaborate protocols to ensure that their blood sacrifices achieved their intended spiritual effects. Understanding these practices requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of political power and the lengths to which human beings will go to maintain their authority over others. The blood-soaked rituals of pagan royalty reveal the dark foundations upon which all political systems are ultimately built. The willingness of some to kill and die in order to rule over the rest. The psychological aftermath of these blood rituals created a unique class of rulers unlike anything seen in human history. These weren't simply political leaders who occasionally resorted to violence. They were individuals whose entire sense of identity had been forged in the crucible of systematic ritual trauma. From childhood, they learned that their worth as human beings was measured by their capacity to endure and inflict extreme suffering in service to supernatural forces they could never fully comprehend. Consider the daily existence of a Celtic queen who had participated in dozens of blood rituals throughout her reign. Her body would be covered in ritual scars, each one marking a specific ceremony where she had shed her blood for the kingdom. But the physical marks were nothing compared to the psychological conditioning that made such self-mutilation feel not just normal but necessary. She would wake each morning knowing that her legitimacy as a ruler depended not on the welfare of her people or the prosperity of her lands, but on her continued willingness to participate in acts that would traumatize any normal human being. The children of these rulers grew up in an environment where extreme violence was not just normalized but sanctified. Royal nurseries weren't places of comfort and protection but training grounds, where future kings and queens learned to associate pain with power, death with divinity. By the time they reached adulthood, these individuals had been so thoroughly conditioned that the thought of ruling without blood sacrifice would have seemed as absurd as trying to govern without armies or taxes. This systematic psychological conditioning created rulers who were simultaneously incredibly powerful and profoundly damaged. They commanded the absolute loyalty of their subjects through their demonstrated willingness to risk death in service to the gods. But they were also trapped in cycles of violence that made normal human relationships nearly impossible. How do you form genuine emotional bonds with family members when you've been trained from childhood to see them primarily as potential sacrificial offerings? The isolation experienced by these rulers was profound and inescapable. They couldn't confide their doubts or fears to advisors who saw them as divine intermediaries. They couldn't seek comfort from family members who might themselves be called upon to participate in future blood rituals. They existed in a world where their every action was scrutinized for signs of divine favor or disfavor, where a moment's hesitation during a sacrifice could be interpreted as evidence that the gods had withdrawn their support. Archaeological evidence from across the ancient world reveals the physical toll that these practices took on royal bodies. Skeletal remains of Celtic, Norse, and Germanic rulers show patterns of healed fractures, ritual scarification, and deliberate bone modifications that speak to decades of systematic self-harm. Some royal skeletons reveal wounds so severe that survival would have required months of careful medical attention, assuming such care was even available in their time. But perhaps most disturbing are the remains that show evidence of attempted healing, followed by deliberate re-injury. These are the bones of rulers who survived particularly brutal rituals, only to voluntarily subject themselves to similar trauma again and again throughout their reigns. The pattern suggests an almost addictive relationship with ritual violence, as if these individuals had become psychologically dependent on the extreme experiences that defined their royal status. The religious specialists who orchestrated these ceremonies, the druids, Godi, and shamans, who interpreted divine will and designed specific rituals, occupied positions of enormous influence but also incredible danger. They were responsible for ensuring that royal blood sacrifices achieved their intended spiritual effects, but they had no way to guarantee success. If a king died during a ritual that failed to bring the desired results, or if a queen survived a ceremony but the kingdom subsequently suffered disasters, these religious advisors could face execution themselves. This created a complex dynamic where spiritual and political authority were constantly balanced against each other through the threat of violence. Druids might recommend specific forms of blood sacrifice to address particular crises, but they did so knowing that their own lives depended on the outcomes. Kings might resist certain ritual requirements, but they risked losing the religious legitimacy that justified their rule. The theological systems that supported these practices were remarkably sophisticated, often incorporating complex astronomical observations, seasonal cycles, and historical precedents to determine when and how blood rituals should be performed. Celtic druids maintained oral traditions that preserved detailed instructions for hundreds of different ceremonial variations, each designed to address specific spiritual or political needs. Norse Godi developed elaborate divination systems that combined rune casting, animal behavior observation, and dream interpretation to determine what forms of sacrifice the gods required. These weren't simple superstitions, but carefully constructed methodologies that had been refined over centuries of practice and observation. The economic cost of these blood rituals was staggering and often contributed to the eventual collapse of the societies that practiced them. Preparing for major royal sacrifices required enormous resources, specially crafted weapons and vessels, elaborate ceremonial clothing, carefully selected victims, and the services of skilled religious specialists. Some ceremonies consumed resources equivalent to feeding entire communities for months. Celtic kingdoms regularly bankrupted themselves, preparing for the seasonal blood festivals that marked their agricultural calendar. The cost of acquiring suitable sacrificial victims, commissioning ritual implements, and maintaining the sacred groves where ceremonies took place often exceeded the kingdom's ability to pay. This economic pressure forced many rulers to launch raids and wars, specifically to capture enough wealth and victims to fund their next blood ritual. Norse jarls and kings faced similar economic challenges, particularly during the elaborate blots that marked seasonal transitions and major political events. The requirement to sacrifice large numbers of animals and human victims, combined with the need to provide feast hospitality for all participants, created financial burdens that many rulers couldn't sustain without constant warfare and plunder. The social dynamics surrounding these rituals created permanent hierarchies based on proximity to sacred violence. Those who participated directly in blood ceremonies, either as performers or victims, occupied the highest levels of spiritual status, while those who merely observed were considered spiritually inferior. This created societies where social mobility was literally dependent on one's willingness to engage with extreme violence. Celtic society developed elaborate systems of ritual participation that determined everything from marriage prospects to inheritance rights. Young nobles who showed courage during blood ceremonies could expect advancement and favorable marriages, while those who displayed fear or reluctance faced social exile and economic disadvantage. Norse culture similarly elevated individuals who demonstrated exceptional bravery during sacrificial rituals, creating a warrior aristocracy that valued ritual violence above military prowess or political skill. The most respected jarls weren't necessarily the most successful in battle, but those who had survived the most dangerous blood ceremonies. The gender dynamics of these practices were complex and varied, significantly between cultures. Celtic society included powerful female druids who orchestrated blood rituals and queens who participated as actively as their male counterparts. Norse culture similarly acknowledged female religious specialists, though the specific roles varied between different tribal groups. However, the physical demands of many blood rituals created natural gender divisions that reinforced existing social hierarchies. Ceremonies that required extreme physical strength or endurance often excluded women, while rituals focused on fertility or seasonal renewal sometimes excluded men. These divisions weren't necessarily discriminatory in the modern sense, but reflected theological beliefs about which gender was most appropriate for communicating with specific deities. The preservation of knowledge about these practices presents unique challenges for modern historians and archaeologists. Many ancient societies maintained strict oral traditions that died out with their practitioners, taking detailed knowledge of specific rituals to the grave. What we know comes primarily from hostile outside observers, Roman writers describing Celtic practices, Christian missionaries documenting pagan rituals they were trying to eliminate, and conquistadors recording Aztec and Maya ceremonies they found abhorrent. These sources are invaluable but deeply problematic. They often exaggerate the violence and brutality of pagan practices while minimizing or ignoring the sophisticated theological reasoning that justified them. Roman accounts of Celtic blood rituals, for example, focus almost exclusively on the shocking aspects of human sacrifice, while completely ignoring the complex spiritual beliefs that made such practices seem necessary and appropriate to their practitioners. Similarly, Spanish chronicles of Aztec and Maya blood ceremonies emphasize the exotic and horrifying elements while failing to understand the cosmic significance these rituals held within indigenous belief systems. Modern scholars must carefully sift through these biased accounts to reconstruct the actual practices and their cultural meanings. Archaeological evidence provides more objective data but raises its own interpretive challenges. Finding evidence of ritual violence doesn't necessarily tell us how that violence was understood by its practitioners. Skeletal remains showing signs of systematic trauma could represent religious sacrifice, criminal punishment, warfare casualties, or medical treatments gone wrong. The discovery of ritual implements, ceremonial vessels, and sacred sites provides valuable context but can't fully explain the psychological and spiritual dimensions of the practices they supported. We can see the physical evidence of blood rituals, but we can only guess at the emotional and spiritual experiences of those who participated in them. Recent advances in forensic archaeology and DNA analysis have begun to provide new insights into ancient blood sacrifice practices. Chemical analysis of stains on ritual vessels can now confirm the presence of human blood and sometimes even identify specific individuals whose blood was used in ceremonies. Isotope analysis of sacrificial victims' remains can reveal their geographic origins, dietary patterns, and sometimes even their social status. These scientific advances are gradually filling in details about practices that were once known only through fragmentary historical accounts. We're beginning to understand not just that these rituals occurred, but how they were organized, who participated in them, and what their immediate effects were on the communities that practiced them. The psychological legacy of these blood-soaked rituals extends far beyond the ancient societies that practiced them directly. The normalization of extreme violence as a tool of political legitimacy created cultural patterns that persisted long after the specific religious beliefs that justified them had been abandoned or forgotten. Medieval European concepts of royal authority, for example, retained many elements derived from earlier pagan blood sacrifice traditions. The elaborate coronation ceremonies that invested kings with divine authority, the ritual scarring and marking that identified royal bloodlines, and the expectation that rulers would personally lead their armies into battle, all echoed earlier practices where kings proved their legitimacy through willingness to shed blood. Even modern political systems retain traces of these ancient connections between violence and authority. The expectation that political leaders will sacrifice themselves for their nations, the ritualized aspects of military service, and the symbolic importance of blood sacrifice in national mythologies all reflect deep cultural patterns established thousands of years ago by pagan rulers who believed their authority came directly from the gods. Understanding these practices doesn't require us to condemn or excuse them, but to recognize them as products of specific historical circumstances and belief systems. The rulers who participated in blood rituals weren't inherently more or less moral than modern political leaders. They were operating within theological and political frameworks that made such practices seem not just acceptable but necessary for the survival of their societies. The blood-soaked rituals of pagan royalty represent one of humanity's most systematic attempts to bridge the gap between earthly political power and divine spiritual authority. They reveal both the extraordinary lengths to which human beings will go to maintain their dominance over others and the profound psychological costs of systems that require leaders to prove their worth through extreme violence. These weren't aberrations or primitive practices that disappeared with the rise of more civilized societies. They were sophisticated approaches to governance that shaped political development across multiple continents and cultures, leaving traces that can still be detected in modern political systems and cultural assumptions. The men and women who participated in these rituals, whether as performers, victims, or observers, were real human beings whose lives were shaped by forces they often couldn't fully understand or control. Their stories remind us that the history of political power is inseparable from the history of violence, and that the structures we take for granted today were built upon foundations of systematic brutality that would shock and horrify most contemporary observers. As we continue our journey through these dark chapters of human history, we must remember that understanding the past requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and the prices that human beings have always been willing to pay to obtain and maintain it. The blood that stained those ancient altars didn't just feed the gods, it fertilized the political systems that continue to shape our world today. The echoes of those ancient blood rituals didn't simply vanish when Christianity spread across Europe, or when conquistadors toppled the Aztec and Inca empires. Instead, they transformed, adapted, and found new expressions in supposedly civilized societies. The psychological patterns established by millennia of sacred violence created cultural DNA that would influence human behavior for centuries to come. Consider the medieval European practice of royal touch, the belief that kings could heal diseases through physical contact. This seemingly benign tradition was actually a direct descendant of pagan blood rituals. Medieval chroniclers record that many kings would deliberately wound themselves before performing these healing ceremonies, allowing their blood to mix with the afflictions of their subjects. The theological reasoning was identical to that of their pagan predecessors. Royal blood contained divine essence that could bridge the gap between mortal suffering and supernatural intervention. The Crusades themselves can be understood as a Christianized version of the mass blood rituals that had defined pagan kingship for thousands of years. Medieval kings didn't just send armies to reclaim the Holy Land. They personally participated in campaigns that they explicitly described as blood offerings to God. The same psychological conditioning that had prepared Celtic and Norse rulers for ritual self-sacrifice now drove Christian monarchs to seek death in battle as proof of their divine favor. The transformation wasn't complete or immediate. Throughout medieval Europe, underground traditions preserved elements of the old blood rituals in forms that could coexist with Christian theology. The practice of royal bloodletting, ostensibly for medical purposes, often followed patterns identical to ancient Celtic auto-sacrifice. Medieval kings would have physicians open their veins during times of political crisis, claiming health benefits while actually performing truncated versions of the blood offerings their ancestors had made to pagan gods. Even the architecture of medieval royal power reflected these ancient influences. The great cathedrals and castles that dominated the European landscape were designed according to principles derived from pagan sacred sites. The same astronomical alignments, geometric proportions, and symbolic orientations that had characterized Celtic stone circles and Norse temple complexes now appeared in supposedly Christian structures. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of ancient blood rituals was their influence on concepts of legitimate violence. The idea that rulers had not just the right but the obligation to use extreme force to maintain their authority became so deeply embedded in European political culture that it survived the transition from paganism to Christianity virtually unchanged. Medieval torture chambers weren't just tools of criminal justice. They were ritual spaces where royal authority was literally written in blood on the bodies of subjects who challenged that authority. The elaborate protocols surrounding public executions, the ceremonial aspects of judicial torture, and the symbolic importance of royal participation in these acts all echoed the sacred violence that had defined pagan kingship. The psychological profiles of medieval European rulers reveal the same patterns of ritualized trauma that had characterized their pagan predecessors. Kings like Edward I of England or Philip IV of France weren't simply cruel or power-hungry. They were individuals whose entire sense of identity had been shaped by cultural traditions that equated legitimate authority with the willingness to inflict and endure extreme violence. The colonial expansion of European powers carried these patterns to new continents, where they encountered indigenous societies with their own traditions of royal blood sacrifice. The Spanish conquest of the Americas wasn't just a clash between Christian and pagan civilizations. It was a collision between two different approaches to sacred violence, each rooted in millennia of systematic ritual trauma. Spanish conquistadors were genuinely horrified by Aztec and Maya blood rituals, but their own behavior followed remarkably similar patterns. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding the conquest and conversion of indigenous peoples, the ritual aspects of colonial administration, and the symbolic importance of mixing Spanish and indigenous blood through intermarriage all reflected European traditions that were themselves descended from ancient pagan practices. The psychological legacy of these encounters created new forms of political authority that combined elements from both traditions. Colonial administrators weren't just governing subjects, they were managing populations whose spiritual relationship to authority had been forged through centuries of blood sacrifice. The resulting power structures required constant violence to maintain their legitimacy, creating cycles of rebellion and repression that would persist for centuries. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of modern nation-states didn't eliminate these patterns but rather scaled them up to unprecedented levels. The mass conscription armies of the 19th and 20th centuries represented a democratization of the blood sacrifice traditions that had once been limited to royal elites. Now, entire populations were expected to prove their loyalty through willingness to die for abstract political concepts that had replaced the gods of their ancestors. The psychological conditioning required to maintain these systems became increasingly sophisticated. Modern military training techniques designed to overcome soldiers' natural reluctance to kill other human beings were essentially industrialized versions of the spiritual preparation that had once prepared pagan princes for ritual combat. The same psychological mechanisms that had enabled Celtic warriors to participate in blood sacrifices now enabled ordinary citizens to function effectively in mechanized warfare. The political rhetoric surrounding these conflicts explicitly invoked the language of sacred sacrifice. Leaders didn't just ask their citizens to fight for strategic objectives, they demanded blood offerings to preserve national honor, racial purity, or ideological principles. The theological framework had changed, but the fundamental relationship between violence and political legitimacy remained identical to that of ancient pagan societies. The 20th century's great totalitarian movements represented the ultimate expression of these ancient patterns. Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, and Maoist China all created political systems that explicitly demanded blood sacrifice from their populations in service to abstract ideological principles. The scale of violence was unprecedented, but the psychological mechanisms were identical to those that had sustained pagan blood cults for thousands of years. Hitler's personal psychology, in particular, reveals striking parallels to the pagan priest kings who had once ruled through ritual violence. His obsession with blood purity, his belief in his own divine mission, and his willingness to sacrifice entire populations to maintain his political authority all echoed the thought patterns of rulers who had been conditioned from childhood to see extreme violence as a sacred duty. The systematic nature of Nazi genocide wasn't just administrative efficiency, it was the industrialization of ritual sacrifice traditions that stretched back to the earliest human civilizations. The elaborate protocols surrounding the Holocaust, the ceremonial aspects of mass murder, and the theological justifications provided for these acts all reflected cultural patterns established by millennia of sacred violence. Even today, in supposedly rational democratic societies, these ancient patterns continue to influence political behavior in subtle but profound ways. The expectation that political leaders will demonstrate their commitment through personal sacrifice, the ritualized aspects of military service, and the symbolic importance of blood sacrifice in national mythologies all reflect cultural DNA that was encoded thousands of years ago in pagan sacred sites. Modern political campaigns often follow patterns derived from ancient blood rituals. Candidates are expected to undergo ordeals that test their physical and psychological endurance. To demonstrate their willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for public service, and to participate in ceremonial events that symbolically recreate the sacred violence that once legitimized royal authority. The media coverage of these campaigns explicitly uses language borrowed from ancient sacrifice traditions. Political commentators describe candidates as being bloodied by attacks, as making blood sacrifices for their causes, and as needing to demonstrate that they have skin in the game. All phrases that would have been perfectly understood by Celtic druids or Norse Godi. The psychological conditioning required to function effectively in modern political systems continues to reflect patterns established by ancient blood ritual traditions. Successful politicians aren't just skilled negotiators or charismatic speakers. They're individuals who have been systematically conditioned to associate personal advancement with willingness to inflict or endure extreme psychological and sometimes physical trauma. Understanding these connections doesn't require us to reject modern political systems or to romanticize ancient pagan practices, but it does demand that we recognize the deep historical roots of patterns that continue to shape human behavior in ways we rarely acknowledge or examine. The blood-soaked rituals of pagan royalty weren't historical curiosities that disappeared with the rise of more civilized societies. They were foundational experiences that established psychological and cultural patterns that continue to influence human political behavior today. The altars may be gone, the sacred groves may have been cleared, and the golden knives may have been melted down, but the deeper structures they created still shape how we understand authority, legitimacy, and the relationship between violence and power. As we close this dark chapter of human history, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that we are all, in some sense, inheritors of these ancient traditions. The political systems we participate in, the cultural assumptions we take for granted, and the psychological patterns that govern our responses to authority all bear the invisible scars of rituals performed thousands of years ago by rulers who believed that their right to govern could only be maintained through systematic sacred violence. The echoes of those ancient drums still beat in the rhythms of modern political life. The smoke from those sacred fires still clouds our vision when we try to understand the true nature of power. And somewhere in the deepest recesses of our collective unconscious, the memory of those blood-soaked altars continues to whisper that true authority can only be earned through willingness to sacrifice everything, including our own humanity, in service to forces we can never fully comprehend or control. The price of understanding this legacy is the recognition that none of us can claim complete innocence from its influence. We are all, whether we acknowledge it or not, participants in systems that trace their ultimate origins to those moonlit groves where ancient rulers once shed their blood in desperate attempts to speak directly to the gods. The question that remains is whether we can learn to recognize these patterns well enough to finally break free from their influence, or whether we are doomed to repeat them in ever more sophisticated and destructive forms.